Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on social epistemology. This is part of our epistemology little topic series, if you will. In the next video, we're going to be talking about another topic that is like under the umbrella of social epistemology, and that is epistemic injustice. We will also take a look there in the next video at Plato's allegory of the cave, and that will help us kind of transition from epistemological ideas to other ideas that we'll cover in the class, things like metaphysics. So this is all part of the broader epistemology topic, which we know that is a subfield of philosophy. Hopefully by now the word epistemology is not intimidating or anything to you. You'll know that it just means the theory of knowledge. So it's a complicated word. And again, if we were in class, I'd have everybody say this word out loud with me, epistemology, because we don't want it to be intimidating. We don't want to be there to be any resistance toward it. It's just the theory of knowledge. All right, so here's what we will take a look at in this video. We'll look at social epistemology. We'll talk about the philosopher who wrote the reading that I asked you all to read, Linda Alcoff. We'll look at some real-world examples she uses to set up the problems that she discusses, that problem being about speaking for others. So then we'll see why that's a problem. And then we'll take a look at some dilemmas and questions that come up under her view. And finally, her proposal for how we should think about speaking for others. All right, so social epistemology then is a different way to look at knowledge than we have been looking. All right, so in our first topic of knowledge, we talked about things like the classical account of knowledge and the Gettier problem. And then we compared that to the work of Dr. Manulani Meyer, who gave us an indigenous perspective on epistemology. And so at that time, what we found was that the traditional Western look at epistemology comes from a very individualistic perspective, right? The question is like, what's going on in our heads when we know something? What counts as knowledge, for example, right? Like we're looking at the nature of knowledge. What counts? Does it have to be a true belief? Does it have to be a justified true belief? Even if we have a justified true belief, then Gettier gives us reason to think that that still might not count as knowledge. And then we took a look at the work of Dr. Meyer, who came from an indigenous perspective, and she was making the point that, look, all of this stuff that you're talking about, this Western approach, it thinks that you can just isolate knowledge, like it can happen just in someone's head and without any context or community around them. And so Dr. Meyer really gives us a different sort of perspective that's going to be more tuned into the type of epistemology we're talking about this week, social epistemology. Right, so the traditional Western view leaves epistemology as some activity that's just happening inside someone's head. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that is, of course, something that's really important. We want to think about what that sense of knowledge is. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the more social components of knowledge. In order to come up with a brief definition of social epistemology for you, in this video, I looked up the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their article on social epistemology. When I looked that up, I noticed that it was actually written by Professor Kaylin O'Connor. She is in my old department, in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at UCI. So that's just a little promotion there. And so if you end up at UCI and you're interested in social epistemology, you should know that at UCI they do wonderful work in epistemology, social epistemology especially. Professor O'Connor does that in my old department, and there are professors like, including Duncan Pritchard, and others like Annalisa Coliva and Anna Boncompagni, who work on social epistemology from the Department of Philosophy. I've mentioned before there's 2 philosophy programs at UCI. So anyways, if you end up at UCI and you're interested in this stuff, look for opportunities to take classes with those folks. So when we think about what social epistemology is, instead of thinking about the individual and like what's going on in someone's head, What social epistemology focuses on is the epistemic effects of social interactions, practices, norms, and systems. So we're going to be thinking about, instead of an individual, we'll think about an epistemic community, a community of knowers, a community of knowledge. In the next video, I'll set that up with some graphics too, where we'll look at like a network of knowers. Right now, we'll just kind of set up what it means to be thinking about knowledge in a social way. We'll be more specific then. All right, so questions that can come up in social epistemology are things like, how should people determine what's true? Like, what are the community standards to figure out what's true? We often rely on others to find out the truth. For example, like very little of our knowledge is through direct personal individual experience. Most of the things we know are things that we rely on others to teach us. You're in college, you're relying on me and your other professors to give you to pass down our knowledge on different topics. When you read books or even watch the news or listen to your friends' accounts, right? We accept testimony of others as knowledge. Community standards and the way a community functions is important to help us gain knowledge based on whether people agree or disagree on certain topics, right? So we care about like what professionals, maybe scientists, for example, agree on or don't agree on. Whether we know something in a community is largely influenced by how well accepted it is into that community. We have standards of belief and justification, right? Like what stands as good grounds to believe something? When do we feel justified in believing something? So the point about this is that epistemology is more than just what's in our head. Looking at epistemology from a social perspective can help us understand how knowledge is transmitted, how it is accepted in a community, and so forth. So it's a real interesting area where there is a lot of current work going on. And so speaking of current work, let's talk about our philosopher here, Linda Martín Alcoff. And she is a professor of philosophy for the City University of New York. She works on the intersections of knowledge, identity, and power. So she specifically, as we'll see in this article as well, in this paper, she's coming from a Panamanian American family heritage. And so she's talking about, she often includes herself in her work in terms of like her identity, because part of her whole point of her philosophy here is that it matters where we are situated. And so we'll talk about what that means soon enough. But there are other topics, like what we'll talk about next in the next video, about epistemic injustice, and that's closely related to the work that Alcoff does here as well. So this is all under the umbrella of social epistemology. When we look at epistemic injustice in the next video, what we'll find is those are knowledge-based injustices. So how someone could suffer an injustice, or how a community could suffer an injustice, that has to do with the knowledge that's available and how it gets transmitted. There's another epistemological theory here called standpoint theory, which is very related and under the umbrella of what Dr. Alcoff does. And standpoint theory really stresses the importance of our experiences and how those affect the way that we have knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that we have. So if you think about a community, standpoint theory would say that those that are marginalized in a community, the people that don't have a lot of power in that community, can often have very important epistemological perspectives, meaning that they have knowledge that the rest of the community members don't have access to, and that's really important for the community to listen to them, because those experiences that they have really shaped their perspectives and give them insight that others in the community just simply don't have access to. So standpoint theory is another really interesting viewpoint that comes up in these discussions as well. All right, so the article or article that I'm asking, the paper that I'm asking you to read for this week, or one of them is The Problem of Speaking for Others. And so this is by Dr. Alkoff, and here she looks at questions like this. When is it legitimate to speak for others? Like, when is it okay to speak for others? When is it harmful to speak for others? So let's jump into this and kind of see where it brings us. All right, so in her paper, she uses a few real-world examples. She begins with this Canadian writer, Anne Cameron. Cameron was a white Canadian author who wrote as Native women in her novels and stories. So her novels and stories were inspired by the lives of Indigenous women in British Columbia. And when she was writing, she took this first person perspective. So she was taking on Indigenous women's voices as narrators. And at first it seemed like her work was being praised because she was bringing attention to the experiences of Native women. But eventually, Indigenous women writers and activists asked her not to do this. They asked her to move over because she was occupying space that should have gone to Indigenous women instead. So the idea here is that, like, even though Cameron had good intentions and she did bring some awareness to issues that Indigenous women in British Columbia were facing, that ultimately her actions were doing more harm than good, because she was taking up space that belonged to other people. The next example that Alkoff uses here, introduces us to this problem with, is a problem that came up with President George H.W. Bush. And that is that he was in 1989, there was a Panamanian dictator named Manuel Noriega, and he nullified democratic elections. So when this happened, President Bush, responded by saying that the voice of the Panamanian people had spoken and that the U.S. would defend their desire for democracy. And so at this point, what ends up happening is that the U.S. invades Panama, and in an operation that was claiming to restore democracy and protect human rights. The problem, though, is that with Bush speaking on behalf of the Panamanian people, instead of letting them speak for themselves, he was claiming to represent their collective will, right? He was claiming to represent them. And to protect their human rights. But many Panamanians saw the invasion as a U.S. imperialistic overreach, and there were civilian casualties and such. And so this was problematic because the idea of speaking for others, meaning to stand up for their democracy and so forth, seem to be used to justify domination or intervention, right? So the voice there was really used as a tool of power. And the third example that Dr. Alkoff uses is about a male professor at a talk that she was at, right? So there was a university symposium on this topic of like feminist and post-colonial issues. So this male professor took the stage and said, look, I don't belong to these groups, so I can't speak for them, and then proceeded to give a talk on architecture instead. And, you know, at first, this withdrawal might seem like the professor was showing his humility. He was understanding that it wasn't his place. But eventually, you know, to Alkoff at least, it comes to represent a sort of problematic silence, right? He was refusing to engage, meaning that he was avoiding responsibility for really reflecting on his own role in this privilege, right? He would just refuse to engage, and so then stopped the attention for that topic and for those peoples whose oppression was going to be discussed, right? So In this example, this example of the male professor is a bit different than those first two examples. In the first two examples, the problem seems to be that there was somebody speaking for others in a problematic way. In the first case, didn't have problematic intentions with Anne Cameron. However, it became problematic when she needed to just move over and allow for that space to be occupied by the people that she was trying to bring attention to, right? And then with President George H.W. Bush, the problematic part comes that the speaking for others is used to justify this military invasion. Well, with this male professor that Alcoff was talking about, it's not necessarily that, right, like he's not speaking for others, but that's kind of the problem, right? So what we're going to see from Alcoff is that we need to have a more nuanced treatment of this. So she looks here in this paper about who can speak for others, how we speak for others, what our sort of social location is, like how we're able to do that, and where we're coming from. Okay, so the worry is that speaking for others can silence the people that we're trying to speak for. But also, as we see with the male professor, refusing to speak for others can also abandon some sort of responsibility. All right, so why is speaking for others a problem? As Alcoff discusses in this paper, epistemic location matters. Okay, so what we mean by epistemic location is that it's where someone speaks from. And where someone speaks from shapes the truth and meaning of what is said. And I want you to think about this, right? So we might have the initial idea that, like, if somebody utters a sentence, it doesn't matter who that person is, that it's either true or false. And maybe ideally in some sort of like power vacuum, in some idealistic society where everybody is seen on equal settings, that might be the case. But in this real world, non-ideal world, the real world from which we live our lives, sentences don't always carry the same sort of weight. And we're going to see examples of this in the next video too, when we talk about epistemic injustice. What we mean when we say where someone speaks from shapes the truth and meaning of what is said, imagine the statement, women face sexism. Okay, so that's a statement, and I think, I don't know, if you just saw it on a piece of paper, imagine probably most people would say that it's true. But if you're hearing it from a speaker, right, or if you're reading the words and those words are attributed to a writer, it can carry very different meanings and feel more true or false based on who's saying it. So one example would be like if a man were to say that women face sexism, it may be interpreted more as objective and enlightened, that it will carry more weight from a man. Whereas if a woman says a sentence like that, women face sexism, it can, not all the time, but it's more likely to come off as more emotionally based, as more biased, right? So the way that or like the place from which we are coming can affect how our words are taken by others, is the point. And this brings with it some, these ideas of privilege and harm. So when people in a privileged position speak for marginalized groups, what can happen is that they can reinforce oppression even if it's unintentional. So even if they don't mean to. So this is not about intention, it's about effect. When somebody is trying to help by speaking on behalf of another group, what may end up happening is that they are unintentionally maybe bringing up problems in a way that doesn't give the group's perspective, but rather gives the perspective, that privileged perspective of that group. All right, so representation is important here. Speaking for others often means representing or constructing their identities. Now, if a speaker is speaking on behalf of a group which they are not from, the problem is that they may end up filling in gaps in their understanding with their own perspectives. It's going to be a constructive process because they're not from that community. they may not have a full grasp on the different aspects of the problems that they are affected by. All right, so let's think of some dilemmas and questions here, right? Because what Elkoff wants to make very clear is she is not saying we should only speak for ourselves, right? Because we have some sort of duty to oppose injustice. So what she doesn't want to be taken to say is that, oh, we're not allowed to speak for anybody but ourselves. That in itself would be pretty problematic as well. I mean, in her third example of the male professor, that was the problem, right? This male professor was refusing to speak for others, but we see that by doing so, he was not really giving any attention to that issue and the injustices that others were suffering. So is the answer that allies should stay silent? Probably not. Elkoff wants us really to distinguish between things like advocacy, solidarity, and appropriation. These can be very difficult to sort out, though. There are fine lines between these, right? So allies in a certain cause will want to advocate for those that are coming from marginalized perspective, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to do all of these things in a way that, well, not all of these things. We don't want to do the last one of appropriation, right? When you are appropriating something else or someone else's issues, then you're like taking it as your own and not allowing them to have their full experience with it. So at least for the first two, advocacy and solidarity, these are like good intentions that people might have when they attempt to speak for others, but we need to be really careful about the way that we do that. So Elkoff says we need to move beyond silence versus arrogance, right? We need to move beyond this like black and white sort of approach to it where either we say all the things or we say none of the things, and we shouldn't be thinking in terms of those extremes. Instead, we should move toward responsible, reflexive speaking. So by reflexive, what we mean is like critically aware, this like critical self-awareness. We're thinking about our position, where we're coming from. Let me give you a quick example. Let's imagine that a journalist is writing on poverty, right? So you can imagine a journalist like writing this article on poverty and really coming from their own perspective, the way that they're talking about the group of folks who are living in poverty may be seen through their own filter of not being in poverty, right? Maybe middle class or upper class or something. And the way that that journalist could be more responsible or reflexive in their writing would be to rely more heavily on the experiences of those of whom they're writing about. They might include more quotations from those people, right? The population that they're writing about, they may collaborate with them more. They may highlight the work that folks in that community have already done, right? So instead of just relying on their own filtered view and observation of this community, they would be reaching out to collaborate with them and really highlighting their own voices. Okay, so that would be a more reflexive approach, more critically self-aware approach. And here's what Elkoff gives us then in her approach. So she wants us to reject both extremes. One extreme that speaking for others is always wrong, and another extreme that we can speak for anybody that we want to. Instead, here are like some guidelines, 4 guidelines that she gives us to help us reflexively think about how we are speaking for others if we decide to do that. And, we should in certain situations. It's not this default that we should always speak for others. In fact, she kind of calls out academics here because academics can oftentimes have this urge to speak for others. They want to interpret it all. They want to be teaching everybody about this issue, especially if they feel like it's a really important issue, if there's an injustice happening. Some folks will want to feel like it's their duty, that's responsibility, and they're doing the morally righteous thing by bringing awareness to the situation. And even though those are good intentions, what Elkoff asks us to do is to fight this like default urge to speak and instead listen, right? Put on our listening ears. So we don't always need to be the ones to teach everybody everything. We can sit back and allow ourselves to be like listeners and to allow ourselves to be taught by others. She also says that we should analyze our social location, right? We should be aware of how our race, gender, class, nationality, and other aspects of our identity shape not only what we see, what we observe, but also about how others observe us and how others hear us. So we should be thinking not only about how our place in society affects the experiences and ideas and beliefs that we have, the knowledge that we have, but also we should be thinking about how we are seen by that society as knowers. If we're in a position that has more privilege or power, right, our words might carry a different sort of weight than the words of people who actually have the relevant knowledge, but are maybe more marginalized in that society, right? So we should be conscious of that. We should be aware of that. We should be accountable and open to criticism. We need to recognize that sometimes we get it wrong. And when we do, we should be hoping that, we should feel honored if others that are from that community, like if we're speaking on behalf of another community and that someone from that community takes the time to teach us and to criticize us and tell us when we're not getting it right, then we should absolutely be accountable to that and we should be open to it. Right, so accountability can help us from coming off as paternalistic, as like we know what's best for that community. It can help us be answerable to the people who we are claiming to care about with talking about their issues in the first place. We should also examine where our speech goes and what it does there, right? So we need to make sure that right, it's not just the location of the speaker or the information contained in the speech that we give. It's also, what also matters here is like where it goes and what it does when it gets there. Like who's listening to it and how is it going to affect them? How is it going to affect their treatment of the population that we're talking about? So we shouldn't just be thinking about our speech and like who we are and what we're saying. We should also be thinking about who's listening. What will their takeaway be? What sorts of actions will happen because of that? How will it affect the community who we are speaking on behalf of? All right, so ultimately what Alcoff is asking us to do is to build from and amplify others' voices rather than replacing them. If we do have the sort of privilege that allows us to bring attention or awareness to an important topic, when the group who is affected by that doesn't typically have as much power in a society for whatever reason, like that's a good thing. That's a good motivation to have, but we need to do that carefully to make sure that we're not ending up doing more harm than good. All right, I hope that you enjoyed this short-ish video on Alcoff's ideas here, the problem of speaking for others. In the next video, we will take a look at epistemic injustice and the work of Miranda Fricker. The article that I'm asking you to read, though, is a shorter one. It's by Demirtas called Epistemic Injustice. And it's very related to what we were just looking at here. And I'm also asking you to read a selection of The Republic by Plato, and then we'll kind of see what he thinks about knowledge, and that will help us kind of bridge between this and future topics. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Bye.